When we picture the end of a massive, civilization-defining conflict, especially the Second World War, there's this very specific, almost cinematic image that gets baked into our collective memory.
Oh, absolutely. The unconditional surrender, the treaties on the battleships.
Right, exactly. The immediate sweeping notion that justice just rolls across the continent,
Yeah.
capturing the perpetrators, closing the book, and ensuring the darkest chapter of history is definitively over. It's a clean break.
It is an incredibly comforting narrative. I mean, people naturally crave that neat, definitive ending.
Yeah.
The idea that a monstrous regime falls and the perpetrators are immediately systematically brought to justice, well, it allows a traumatized world to sleep at night.
For sure.
The story we're taught in grade school is fundamentally one of absolute moral victory, where the collapse of the Third Reich meant the total, immediate eradication of its architects.
But then you look at the raw data, you look at a stack of primary source documents, and specifically for this deep dive, we are talking about a massive dump of over 1,850 highly classified intelligence files.
Unbelievable amount of paper.
Right. Files that were suddenly released in Argentina in May of 2025. And the moment you open those files, that cinematic, comforting image it shatters into a million pieces.
Like, completely dissolves.
Because these aren't just dry, bureaucratic post-war memos. You are stepping into a massive investigation today, looking at the financial receipts, the coded bank statements, the police dossiers of history's most notorious monsters.
The actual ledgers of evasion.
Yeah, men who did not face a tribunal. Men who they packed their bags, funded their escapes, and started over. So welcome. Our mission for this deep dive is to map the exact mechanics of what were known as the rat lines.
And you really see the systemic complicity here.
We're going to explore how states and shockingly high-ranking clergy members actively enabled thousands of fascist fugitives to escape to Latin America. And we aren't stopping in the past.
No, because it doesn't stop in the past.
Exactly. We're going to trace how the financial architecture of those 1940s escapes directly fuels the highly synchronized resurgence of neo-Nazi cells that we're seeing in South America today.
My role as a historian is generally to decode the past, to look at macro trends and try to understand how societies transition after profound trauma.
Right.
But what we have here, what you're tracking as an investigative journalist looking at this new paper trail, well, it proves this is not a closed chapter.
Not at all.
It isn't just history. The structures established in 1945 laid a very real, very physical foundation for extremist movements operating right now.
We're dissecting the source material to prove that this is a living, breathing geopolitical issue. But to understand the present, we have to start at the exact moment the old world collapsed, May 1945.
The systemic collapse of the Third Reich.
Right. We're looking at one of the largest clandestine migrations of war criminals, SS officers, and collaborators in modern history.
The sheer scale of this movement is usually the first thing that shocks people. We're talking about an estimated 10,000 individuals who managed to utilize highly organized, heavily funded escape routes.
10,000. It's just staggering.
It is. Their primary immediate goal was straightforward. Evade the encroaching Allied armies, avoid prosecution at Nuremberg, and just escape the absolute economic and infrastructural devastation of post-war Europe.
They needed a way out, and they needed it immediately.
Exactly.
And moving 10,000 people without the Allies noticing, or as we'll see later, without them caring, is wild. Now, some went to the U.S., Canada, Australia, even the Middle East, but the overwhelming majority looked across the Atlantic to South and Central America.
Argentina being the primary haven.
Yeah, the declassified sources show Argentina absorbed anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000 fleeing fascists. Brazil took in up to 2,000, Chile took up to 1,000. And there were active corridors funneling them into Paraguay, Uruguay, Bolivia, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Mexico.
The geographic concentration is the crucial starting point here. Why did so many choose this specific continent? It wasn't just a desperate random scattering.
No, it was calculated.
Deeply calculated, rooted in demographic groundwork that had been laid decades earlier. Latin America already possessed massive, culturally isolated, ethnic German populations.
Right. The numbers from the mid-1980s show this profound demographic footprint. We're looking at roughly 3.6 million ethnic Germans in Brazil, 1 million in Argentina, 200,000 in Paraguay. These were established multi-generational communities.
Consider the reality of these communities, particularly in the southern states of Brazil. Places like Santa Catarina and Rio Grande do Sul.
Yeah.
You had massive enclaves living in profound cultural and linguistic isolation. They preserved the traditions, the exact dialects, and the social structures of their ancestral homeland.
Okay, let's unpack this because this demographic reality is key. The rising Nazi regime in the 1930s didn't ignore these overseas populations, did they?
It's not at all. They initiated highly targeted, aggressive National Socialist propaganda campaigns directed precisely at these South American communities.
And the sources mention this was wildly successful. It actually created the largest foreign section of the Nazi Party anywhere in the world, right there in Brazil, with 2,822 official card-carrying members spread across 17 different states.
They systematically cultivated loyalty. So when the war ended and the right collapsed, these escaping war criminals weren't sailing into the terrifying unknown.
They weren't landing on alien shores where they'd instantly stick out.
Exactly. These deep-rooted German enclaves served as a critical, pre-existing protective social fabric. It allowed arriving fugitives to blend in almost seamlessly.
I mean, think about it. If you're a wanted fugitive, literally running from a global military manhunt, usually the hardest part of escaping isn't the physical travel, it's the landing.
Right, integrating.
You don't speak the language, your customs are different, no local currency, no network, you're highly visible. But for these men, it was like stepping into a pre-built international safe house.
A sanctuary where everyone already wears your uniform, metaphorically speaking.
Yeah, they walked off a boat into a neighborhood where the butcher speaks their exact dialect of Bavarian German, the local school teaches their culture, and their neighbors secretly, or not so secretly, sympathize with their politics.
The social fabric acted as an invisibility cloak. But, a sympathetic neighborhood doesn't protect you from a federal extradition warrant. You also have to look at the political structure of the host nations at that time.
Because many of these Latin American countries, particularly Argentina under Juan Domingo Perón, were ruled by authoritarian regimes, or at least governments with incredibly strong fascist leanings.
Exactly.
Wait, I need to push back on this a bit, though. I understand authoritarian leaders might admire the fascist aesthetic, but harboring globally hunted war criminals seems like a massive geopolitical liability.
It does on the surface, yeah.
You bring the eyes of U.S. intelligence, Soviet intelligence, Israeli operatives right to your doorstep. Was some middle manager who used to be in the SS really worth that kind of international risk for a South American dictator?
It is a brilliant question, and it requires us to understand the transactional mindset of these regimes. They didn't view these men as moral liabilities. They viewed them as massive strategic assets.
Assets.
Think about it. If you were an authoritarian leader trying to consolidate power, crush domestic communist movements, or modernize your military infrastructure, who better to hire than highly trained European military officers, counterespionage experts, and scientists?
Wow. So they just ignored the history.
Completely.
Yeah.
The atrocities of the Holocaust were viewed by these dictators as Europe's problem. What mattered to Perón, or Pinochet later on, was whether this fugitive could build a better radar system or advise their secret police on interrogation techniques.
The moral weight was entirely ignored in favor of utility. That transactional view of human life is chilling. Just, we don't care who you kill in Poland, as long as you can upgrade our Air Force.
It's brutal pragmatism.
But knowing the destination and knowing why they were welcomed is only half the equation. The really mind-boggling part of this investigation is the logistics of the journey itself.
The actual transit.
Right. To understand how thousands of heavily scrutinized men crossed oceans undetected while the Allies were theoretically hunting them, we have to look at the institutions that stamped their passports. Institutions that were supposed to represent the absolute highest ideals of global morality and neutrality.
Right. The mechanisms of escape. The rat lines, or the Ratenlinien. We need to emphasize that this was not a chaotic, desperate scramble through the mud. It was an institutionalized, highly structured escape mechanism.
The documents map out two primary geographic corridors. Route number 1 started in Germany, passed through France, Spain, because Francisco Franco was a sympathetic fascist dictator who essentially offered his country as a massive, safe stopover. And then they crossed the Atlantic directly to Argentina from Spanish ports.
And the second route, which is perhaps even more complex and historically revealing, funneled fugitives from Germany down through northern Italy.
Down through the Alps.
Yes, using transit nodes in South Tyrol, places like Murano and Bolzano. From there, they moved down to Rome and finally to the Italian port city of Genoa to secure transatlantic passage.
But practically speaking, getting from a bombed-out hideout in Germany to a bustling port in Genoa requires massive amounts of paperwork. You can't just walk onto a transatlantic ocean liner in 1946.
It absolutely cannot.
It requires money, military clearance, transit visas, and somebody official vouching for you. And this is where the paper trail takes a deeply disturbing turn. The logistics of these rat line networks relied heavily on the active, enthusiastic complicity of high-ranking clergy members within the Roman Catholic Church.
What's fascinating here is the ideological justification behind this clerical complicity. It's one of the darkest psychological studies of the post-war era.
How do they even justify it?
You have to immerse yourself in the Vatican's mindset during the immediate aftermath of 1945. The Soviet Union's Red Army was occupying half of Europe. Within the Catholic Church, there was a militant, profound, almost apocalyptic terror of communism.
Okay, so they saw the Soviets as the ultimate threat.
Exactly. For key figures within the Church, National Socialism, despite its widely known horrific atrocities, was viewed retroactively as a necessary, if flawed, bulwark against the spread of atheistic Soviet Bolshevism.
And the sources name specific individuals. We aren't talking about rogue parish priests in the countryside. We are looking at Austrian Bishop Alois Hudal, the rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico in Rome, a major Vatican institution.
A very powerful figure.
And a Croatian Franciscan priest named Krunoslav Draganovic. These are men with serious structural ecclesiastical authority. Are we really saying their hatred of communism was so intense that they looked at the smoking ruins of extermination camps and decided to actively save the men who built them?
They absolutely did. For men like Hudal and Draganovic, the looming threat of the Soviet Union conquering Christian Europe was the ultimate existential evil. Fascism, in their twisted calculus, was a lesser evil that had protected the Church's interests.
Wow!
They utilized their high standing within the Vatican to physically harbor fugitives in monasteries and convents. But more importantly, they navigated the incredibly complex international bureaucracy of post-war Europe on behalf of these men.
Okay, let's break down the actual mechanics of that bureaucracy, because the sources specifically mention the exploitation of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC.
Yes, this is crucial.
How exactly do high-ranking priests collude with an international medical and humanitarian organization to hand literal get-out-of-jail-free cards to mass murderers? What was the actual loophole?
To understand the loophole, you have to visualize post-war Europe. It was complete bureaucratic chaos. You had millions of displaced persons, Holocaust survivors, refugees, forced laborers, fleeing civilians.
It's massive displacement.
The international system was entirely overwhelmed. Nobody had passports. National governments had collapsed. So the Red Cross stepped in to issue emergency travel documents.
Specifically, a document known as the 10.111, right?
Yes, the 10.111, which acted as a temporary, universally recognized passport to help these victims relocate.
So the Red Cross is just trying to process millions of desperate people. They don't have time to run deep background checks on every single refugee.
Precisely. The Red Cross didn't have intelligence databases. They relied on trusted institutional authorities to vouch for the identity of the person applying for the document.
Ah, I see where this is going.
If a respected Vatican bishop like Hudal submitted a list of names, declaring them to be stateless Catholic refugees from Eastern Europe fleeing Soviet persecution, the Red Cross clerks accepted it.
They just stamped it.
They did. Hudal and Draganovic leveraged the immense moral authority of the Church to vouch for fleeing SS officers, securing these 10.111 travel documents under completely false names.
As a journalist, you spend your life looking for instances where good intentions are weaponized. But seeing charitable organizations structurally built to heal, to protect the vulnerable, to bandage the wounds of war, literally weaponized to facilitate the escape of the ultimate perpetrators. It's just a profound shock.
It is deeply unsettling.
The priests used the chaotic bureaucracy designed to save the victims to act as a shield for the murderers.
And once an SS officer held that Red Cross 10.111 document, they had a clean, internationally recognized identity. With that piece of paper in hand, securing a South American visa became a mere bureaucratic formality. They ceased being hunted war criminals and officially became sympathetic refugees.
But a forged Red Cross document only gets you past the exit guards in Europe. If you're sailing across the Atlantic with a fake name, someone has to let you off the boat on the other side.
Right.
And that requires a government willing to look the other way, or in this case, actively roll out the red carpet.
Which brings us squarely back to state sponsorship, and specifically The Argentine government under President Juan Domingo Perón.
The 2025 declassified intelligence files offer a staggering level of detail on this. Perón didn't just turn a blind eye to a few stragglers. He actively facilitated these arrivals.
Yes, the source material highlights how Perón's regime deeply admired the European fascist aesthetic. They loved the corporate structure, the massive grand rallies, the militarized society.
Perón saw a kindred spirit in the organizational structure of fascism.
He did. He wanted to import that expertise, to industrialize Argentina and build his own intelligence apparatus. So he established his own coordinated networks, stretching through Scandinavia and Switzerland, specifically designed to ease the passage of these fugitives.
He wasn't passively receiving them. He was reaching across the ocean to pull them in.
Exactly.
The documents show Argentine agents were physically deployed to Europe. They were sitting in offices in Italy and Spain, actively handing out travel documents, and in many cases, paying for the transit expenses.
State-funded relocation for war criminals.
And once they arrived in Buenos Aires, they didn't just scatter into the wind and hide in the shadows. They organized. You have prominent fugitives like the highly decorated Luftwaffe fighter pilot Hans Ulrich Rudel setting up an organization called the Kameradenwerk, or Comrades Work.
The Kameradenwerk was an incredibly effective piece of social engineering. It was essentially a highly efficient mutual aid society strictly for Nazis in South America.
I was trying to think of a modern equivalent for this, and the closest thing I can imagine is a sort of dark web LinkedIn specifically for fascist fugitives.
That's a great way to put it.
They pooled their financial resources, provided legal defense funds, helped new arrivals find housing, and actively monitored international search efforts to warn each other if Nazi hunters were closing in.
It was a dedicated infrastructure of evasion.
Entirely funded and operated by the fugitives themselves, operating openly with the blessing of the Argentine government.
The dark web LinkedIn analogy is incredibly apt. It was a professional networking group for evasion. But as glaring as the Argentine complicity is, we have to look at the other major players in the early Cold War.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the Western allies, the powers that had just won the war, were far from innocent in this process. The sources detail the heavy involvement of United States military intelligence, specifically the Army's Counterintelligence Corps, the CIC, operating out of occupied Austria and Germany.
This is the part of the story that forces a massive reevaluation of post-war morality. We have the US CIC looking at these existing clerical escape routes, specifically the rat line run by the Croatian priest Draganovic. How exactly did the US interact with this network? Did they try to shut it down?
They did the exact opposite. They co-opted it.
They co-opted it. Unbelievable.
The U.S. intelligence apparatus recognized that Draganovic had built an incredibly efficient leak-proof pipeline out of Europe. As the Cold War escalated, the U.S. CIC had their own people they needed to move.
Anti-Soviet informants, Eastern European defectors.
And highly prized scientific assets. So instead of arresting Draganovic for smuggling war criminals, they essentially put him on the payroll. They paid him cold, hard cash per head to use the very same rat lines that were smuggling out SS officers to smuggle out American intelligence assets.
This feeds directly into Operation Paperclip, doesn't it? The systemic effort to bring between 1,000 and 2,000 German scientists to the United States to work on weapons development, the space program, and espionage.
Operation Paperclip is the most famous, heavily documented example of this moral compromise. Western intelligence agencies essentially established a new global precedent. Geopolitical utility, the urgent need to win the Cold War against the Soviets, totally superseded post-war justice.
So what does this all mean?
The moral compromise was absolute and systemic. If you possessed intimate knowledge about Soviet troop movements, or if you understood the aerodynamics of a V-2 rocket, your past associations with the SS or your involvement in slave labor were quietly scrubbed from your file or intentionally ignored.
I really want to pause and process the sheer scale of the hypocrisy here. We have the United States standing as the ultimate moral arbiter, prosecuting the highest-ranking Nazis at the Nuremberg trials in front of the global press.
Right. Highly publicized justice.
They are hanging men for crimes against humanity, while simultaneously, in the shadows of Vienna and Rome, U.S. intelligence officers are handing envelopes of cash to a fascist priest to pay for the escape tickets of other Nazis, purely because they might be useful against the Russians.
It is a devastating hypocrisy, and the consequences of that flexibility were dire. Because the leniency wasn't just extended to scientists or rocket engineers. This environment of moral compromise allowed highly notorious, violently sadistic figures to escape with direct, documented Western assistance.
The prime example detailed in our sources is Klaus Barbie.
Yep.
Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, the Gestapo chief in France who was personally responsible for unspeakable torture, the deportation of thousands of Jewish children to extermination camps, and the systematic dismantling of the French resistance.
Barbie is the ultimate case study of Cold War compromise. After the war, Barbie was actively shielded by the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps. They didn't just ignore him, they hired him.
They hired the Butcher of Lyon.
They found his ruthless skills in anti-communist interrogation and informant handling highly useful in occupied Germany. But eventually, the French authorities discovered he was alive and began aggressively demanding his extradition for crimes against humanity.
So the U.S. is caught hiding a man the French, their own ally, want to execute. What do?
Well, the CIC realized he had become a massive political liability. But instead of handing him over to face justice, they utilized Dragnovich's rat line. They provided Barbie with false papers and facilitated his escape to Bolivia in 1951.
They helped him escape to South America, and the sources show he didn't just retire quietly to a farm in the Andes, he leaned into his expertise.
Yes, he did.
He went on to advise brutal Bolivian military dictatorships on internal security, utilizing the exact same interrogation and torture tactics he perfected under the Gestapo. He literally exported his terror.
The trauma and the violence of the European theater were packed up and shipped to South America, facilitated by the very powers that had just spent millions of lives defeating fascism.
But the logistics of all this, setting up a new life, bribing port authorities in Genoa, printing high-quality forged documents, sending Argentine intelligence agents to Europe, paying off priests, and running an international mutual aid network.
It's massively expensive.
Right. None of this operates on good vibes alone. This requires massive liquid capital. Where did the money for this dark renaissance come from? This leads us to the ultimate paper trail, the financial architecture that was fully exposed in the 2025 document dump.
You cannot move 10,000 people clandestinely across oceans without a highly sophisticated financial architecture. The newly declassified files are unequivocal on this point.
Right.
The rat lines and the subsequent high-standard post-war lives of these fugitives were heavily financed by stolen assets, systematically laundered gold, and the looted wealth of Jewish victims across Europe.
The sources outline how, as the Axis powers realized the war was lost, they began systematically transferring this looted wealth out of Europe. They knew they couldn't just bury it in a forest. They used the international banking system.
And the 2025 investigations focus heavily on European financial institutions, specifically singling out Swiss banking institutions like Credit Suisse and its predecessor banks.
The role of Swiss banking secrecy is the linchpin of this entire financial narrative. Switzerland maintained its neutrality during the war, which meant its banks could interact with anyone. These financial networks actively assisted Nazi agents in camouflaging transactions.
Exactly.
Let's get into the mechanics of this, because laundering gold sounds like a spy movie trope. Practically speaking, how does one launder physical gold and turn it into fiat currency in a Buenos Aires bank account in 1946?
It functioned very similarly to how modern criminal syndicates use cryptocurrency tumbling to obscure the origin of funds.
Oh, interesting.
The Nazis had massive quantities of gold looted from central banks of conquered nations, as well as gold extracted from Holocaust victims. This gold would be physically moved to Switzerland.
Okay.
The Swiss banks would melt it down, removing the Nazi stamps, and recast it. They would then credit numbered, totally anonymous bank accounts with the value of that gold.
So the physical blood-stained gold stays in a vault in Zurich, but the value is digitized, or in 1946 terms, turned into telegraphic credits.
Exactly, the mechanism. Once the value was in a numbered Swiss account, the bank could issue a letter of credit or wire the funds via telegraph to a corresponding branch in Buenos Aires or São Paulo.
And then the fugitive arrives in Argentina, walks into a local bank, and accesses funds that are completely detached from their horrific origin.
Yes, and that clean money then directly financed the logistics of the rat lines and purchased the homes, businesses, and political influence the fugitives enjoyed in their South American sanctuaries.
They essentially turned the blood money of the Holocaust into a subsidized pension fund for the perpetrators.
It's horrific.
And for decades, the precise details of these financial operations, the actual ledgers, the account numbers, and the true extent of the South American state complicity were locked away in vaults. They were kept strictly confidential under the impenetrable guise of banking secrecy and state security.
Which is why the events of 2025 are so historically monumental and why your investigation is so timely.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
For 80 years, historians were forced to work with fragments. We had testimonies, we had incomplete memoirs, we had rumors. Argentina had declassified some lower-level documents back in 1992 under President Menem, but the most sensitive financial ledgers and the deep intelligence files remained entirely hidden.
Till very recently.
The timeline of this is what makes it so visceral. You have to realize we are sitting here having this conversation in 2026. This massive breakthrough, this smoking gun empirical evidence, was only declassified last year.
It's incredible.
On February 18th, 2025, Argentine President Javier Milei held a highly publicized meeting at the Casa Rosada with leaders of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Out of that meeting, Milei ordered the rapid, unredacted declassification and digitization of this major trove of historical documents.
Over 1,850 distinct files officially released to the public in May 2025 through the Argentine National Archive, the AGN.
And these weren't standard diplomatic memos.
No, these were deep state files compiled by top intelligence agencies, federal police forces, and the Ministry of Defense spanning 3 decades, from the early 1950s through the 1980s.
You really have to pause and realize how fiercely these governments fought to keep the financial blood money hidden. It took 80 full years after the war ended for us to finally see the bank statements. We finally have the ledgers.
We have document-based proof of the extensive financial networks, the local bank account numbers, and the institutional protections that allowed the worst criminals in human history to securely manage their funds.
The 2025 release removes the last shreds of plausible deniability. You can argue with a rumor, you can dismiss a supposed sighting in a jumble cafe, but you cannot argue with a synchronized bank ledger.
You really can't.
Yeah.
The files proved that figures like Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele didn't just slip through the cracks of a chaotic system. They were purposefully integrated into a financial and political system that was explicitly designed to protect them.
Now that we understand the intricate routes they took, the priests who stamped their papers and the laundered gold that paved the way, we need to look closely at exactly who utilized these networks.
And their post-war lives.
Right. And frankly, the most shocking part of this section isn't just recounting the crimes they committed in Europe. It's the terrifyingly mundane, deeply comfortable, banal corporate lives they led once they arrived.
The roster of fugitives in South America is the ultimate study in the banality of evil. We're talking about the primary architects of the Holocaust, the men who commanded extermination camps where millions perished. And yet, when they arrived in South America, they didn't act like hunted monsters. They became middle managers, local businessmen, and technical advisors.
Let's start with Adolf Eichmann, the SS Obersturmbannführer, the head of the department responsible for the entire logistical architecture of the Holocaust. This is the man who mathematically figured out the train schedules required to transport millions of human beings to extermination camps.
Eichmann is a perfect example of the systemic evasion we've discussed. He arrived in Argentina in 1950.
And how did he cross the ocean? He used the exact clerical rat line we described, securing a forged Red Cross passport, vouched for by sympathetic clergy under the alias Ricardo Clement.
And what does the architect of the Holocaust do when he settles in Buenos Aires? He gets a corporate job at a Mercedes-Benz automotive plant.
I want to really dwell on the utter dissonance of that reality. Imagine Adolf Eichmann, a man carrying the weight of millions of deaths, waking up, complaining about his daily commute, clocking in at a factory, and using his logistical expertise to manage supply chains for car parts.
It's hard to reconcile.
He lived that utterly mundane middle-class existence for a decade until the Israeli Mossad finally tracked him down, captured him on a Buenos Aires street in 1960, smuggled him to Jerusalem, and executed him in 1962.
The dissonance is the point, though. It highlights how seamlessly, how frictionlessly they transitioned from orchestrating genocide to participating in the modern corporate economy. They weren't hiding in fortified caves or remote cinematic jungle compounds. They were your neighbors.
Yeah.
Take Josef Mengele, the notorious physician at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the man responsible for horrific, lethal human experimentation on children and twins.
The angel of death. The records show he arrived in Argentina in 1949, initially utilizing the alias Gregor Helmut. But the documents from the 2025 release show a level of arrogance that is hard to fathom.
Extreme arrogance.
He didn't even feel the need to keep his head down permanently. In 1958, while living in Uruguay, he actually remarried, and he signed the marriage certificate under his real name.
Signing a legal document with your globally hunted name demonstrates an incredible, almost pathological level of confidence in your own impunity. He knew the local authorities were not going to arrest him.
It was only after Eichmann was dramatically snatched off the street by Mossad in 1960 that Mengele got spooked.
Right. The Camaraden work network warned him, and he fled to Paraguay and eventually deeper into Brazil. The tragedy of Mengele is that he was never brought to justice. He lived out his life and died peacefully of a stroke while swimming in the ocean in Brazil in 1979.
The ultimate escape. But then you have a tier of men who didn't just hide out in the corporate world, but actively offered their dark, specialized expertise to the new dictatorships rising in Latin America. We already discussed Klaus Barbie advising the Bolivian security forces, but look at the case of Walter Rolf.
Walter Ruff is a truly terrifying case study in the continuity violence. He was the SS Standardführer who designed and coordinated the deployment of mobile gas vans in Eastern Europe.
Just horrific.
These vehicles were used to murder nearly 100,000 people, mostly women and children, before the stationary extermination camps were fully operational.
And the logistics of his post-war life are just as absurd. He flees Europe, arrives in Ecuador in 1949, and then eventually settles in Chile in 1958. And what is the post-war career of the man who designed mobile execution chambers?
It's almost unbelievable.
He manages a king crab cannery in Punta Arenas. Again, the absolute absurdity of the banality. But he doesn't stop at the cannery. When General Augusto Pinochet takes power in a military coup, Ralph becomes an advisor to Pinochet's brutal secret police, the DNA.
It is the literal transfer of technology. He took the logistical knowledge of state-sponsored murder, the mechanics of disappearing people that he perfected in the Third Reich, and applied it to the systematic repression of political dissidents in Cold War Chile.
And despite repeated, desperate extradition requests from West Germany and Israel, the Chilean courts actively, legally blocked them.
Yes. Rolf died a free man in Santiago in 1984, and his funeral was openly attended by a crowd giving the Nazi salute.
It makes my blood boil just reading the timeline.
Yeah.
And the list in these files just goes on and on. You have Franz Stangl, the commandant of both the Sobibor and Treblinka extermination camps, where upwards of 1 million people were murdered.
He escapes through the Rome rat line, goes to Syria, and ends up in Brazil in 1951.
And works a completely normal job at a Volkswagen plant in Sao Paulo until a Nazi hunter finally tracks him down and he is arrested in 1967. You have Erich Prübke, who participated in the horrific Ardeatine Caves massacre in Italy, moving to Bariloche, Argentina.
And he becomes a respected pillar of the community, acting as the director of the local German school. He lived openly, under his real name, in a picturesque mountain town until 1994.
The Prübke case really underscores the environment of total normalized impunity within those cultural enclaves. They weren't outcasts, they were respected members of their communities.
You also have Herbert Kukers, the butcher of Riga, who was personally responsible for the mass murder of Latvian Jews. He openly operated a tourist aviation business in Brazil, flying sightseers around, until Mossad operatives lured him to Uruguay and assassinated him in 1965.
And while Argentina, Brazil, and Chile were the main heavily populated hubs, the declassified sources point out lesser-known nodes in the network that are equally fascinating. Colombia, for example, served as a highly active transit point and logistical node for fugitives who needed to move further south.
The archives from the Simon Wiesenthal Center and cross-referenced Mossad files confirm that Bogotá was frequently used to facilitate movement and launder funds.
But some individuals chose to stay. Dr. Herbert Runge, a German physician who was heavily involved in the brutal medical system of the Third Reich, immigrated to Colombia in 1950. He didn't hide. He just practiced medicine unmolested in major hospitals in Medellin for years.
And just like Brazil and Argentina, Colombia had a deeply entrenched pre-war history with National Socialism. By 1938, there were over 5,000 German citizens living in Colombia, with highly active Nazi Party cells operating in cities like Barranquilla and Bogotá, hosting massive public meetings complete with swastika flags.
Colombia is an interesting geopolitical case because they did officially sever diplomatic ties with Germany in 1941 and declared war in 1943. They even collaborated with the U.S. intelligence to deport suspected Axis agents to internment camps in Texas.
But the declassified files showed that those clandestine networks, the sympathies, and the financial ties persisted underneath the official surface.
And those persistent underground networks fueled some wild, persistent conspiracy theories. Which brings us to a fascinating document in the sources, the famous 1955 CIA file regarding Colombia.
Oh, this one is always a talking point.
Right. The CIA actually opened a formal investigation because an informant claimed that a man bearing a striking resemblance to Adolf Hitler was living in Colombia under the alias Adolf Schrittelmeyer. They even had a grainy photograph of the supposed look-alike.
The Hitler in South America theory is perhaps the most enduring myth of the post-war era. The 1955 investigation was quickly dropped by the CIA due to a complete lack of credible evidence, confirming what serious historians and forensic evidence have always maintained.
That Hitler died by suicide in his bunker in Berlin in April 1945.
Yes.
I find this detail so revealing about human psychology. The Hitler survived conspiracy is so sticky in pop culture. There are endless documentaries and internet threads about it. But honestly, as I look at these 2025 files, I think the persistence of these massive conspiracy theories actively distracts us from the terrifying truth.
How so?
The actual monsters, the men who built the camps, drove the gas vans, and routed the trains, didn't need to fake their deaths in a bunker or escape in a secret high-tech submarine to a hidden Antarctic base. They just got jaws and middle management at Mercedes-Benz and Volkswagen. They ran crab canneries. They directed local elementary schools. The reality is far more chilling than the conspiracy because the reality involves the mundane complicity of the everyday world.
That is a profound point. The banality of their survival, the fact that they integrated into normal society, is what makes the history of the rat line so disturbing. It implicates the normal world.
Yeah, exactly.
And this continent-wide network of evasion touched nearly every border. We see records of individuals using Mexico as a transit waypoint to obscure their travel history, or Ecuador acting as a temporary landing pad. Venezuela absorbed several high-profile violent collaborators from Baltic and Nordic volunteer SS units. The infrastructure was vast.
You might logically think that with the passing of these men Mengele dying on a beach in 1979, Ruff dying in bed in 1984, Barbie dying in prison in 1991, that the story reaches its natural conclusion.
You would hope so.
The fugitives die out, the financial ledgers get declassified in 2025, and it becomes a closed historical loop, safely contained in the past. But according to the intelligence sources we are reviewing today, that is the single most dangerous assumption we could possibly make.
It absolutely is.
Because the physical infrastructure they built, the laundered wealth they transferred, and most importantly, the toxic ideologies they nurtured in those culturally isolated enclaves, well, they did not die with them.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the physical survival of the perpetrators transitioned into the ideological survival of their movement. This brings us to the most urgent, immediate part of our investigation: the contemporary landscape.
Yes, this is where it all leads.
The historical presence of these post-war fugitives and the active preservation of those undenazified German enclaves over decades have directly, measurably influenced a massive resurgence of right-wing extremism in Latin America today.
We are officially no longer talking about history. We are talking about the headlines of today. The geopolitical sources make it absolutely clear Brazil is currently the epicenter of a highly synchronized, incredibly active neo-Nazi resurgence in Latin America.
It's alarming.
Recent reports from monitoring agencies and the Organization of American States have identified over 500 active neo-Nazi cells operating within Brazil right now.
500 active cells in a single nation. And if you analyze the geographic concentration of those cells, the data is deeply terrifyingly telling. The extremist activity is heavily concentrated in the southern states.
Specifically Santa Catarina, Rio Grande do Sul, and São Paulo, which maps absolutely perfectly onto the historical German settlement zones we talked about in the very first section of this investigation. It is the exact same geography that boasted the largest foreign Nazi party in the 1930s. The correlation is staggering.
The demographic data matches the modern extremist data precisely. The undenazified enclaves of the 1940s and 50s acted as highly effective ideological incubators.
Because these communities were culturally isolated.
Right. They preserved the authoritarian traditions, the rhetoric of ethnic isolation, and the conservative racial politics for decades without the societal pushback that occurred in post-war Germany. And now, fueled by the professionalization of the modern far right, the borderless use of digital technologies, and extreme global political polarization, those dormant seeds planted 80 years ago have sprouted into these 500-plus active organized cells.
And these aren't just isolated, angry young men posting manifestos on obscure internet message boards. The intelligence reports show they are establishing robust, transnational connections with global white supremacist networks.
They're coordinating.
They are actively linking up with groups like the Hammerskins, a notoriously violent international white supremacist gang, and the European New Right, the Nouvelle Droite movements, which provide a pseudo-intellectual framework for ethno-nationalism. They are networking, sharing tactics, and moving funds globally, acting remarkably like the original Ratlines networked.
They're utilizing the modern digital equivalent of the Kameradenwerk. And the response from local authorities to this explosive growth is, in some cases, terrifyingly reminiscent of the passive complicity we saw in the past.
Let's get into that, because in late 2024, Ashwini KP, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, conducted an official, deeply documented visit to Brazil. She presented alarming findings specifically regarding the state of Santa Catarina.
The UN Rapporteur's report is crucial.
I want to zero in heavily on her findings because they bridge the gap between historical state complicity and modern governance. The UN rapporteur explicitly highlighted a deep-seated institutional denialism operating within Santa Catarina. She noted that local authorities, police forces, and politicians systematically downplayed or outright ignored the existence of these 500 cells.
It's a deliberate blind spot.
How does a modern democratic state just deny the existence of a synchronized extremist movement holding rallies in their own backyard? Is this institutional denialism just a modern continuation of the same systemic complicity we saw with Perón in the 1950s?
It functions as a form of passive complicity, certainly. By refusing to acknowledge the threat, by dismissing it as isolated incidents or harmless free speech, local authorities provide the oxygen and the space for the movement to grow unhindered. This denialism is incredibly dangerous because it allows historically rooted extremist ideologies to migrate from marginal underground subcultures directly into mainstream political discourse. If the police don't treat them as a threat, the public assumes they are a legitimate political faction.
And the political stakes of this normalization could not be higher. This resurgence isn't happening in a vacuum. It is actively threatening the stability of the state. In early 2025, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva explicitly, publicly addressed this crisis.
Yes, his speech was a turning point.
During a high-level ministerial meeting, he declared that the upcoming 2026 electoral campaign had effectively already begun, and he framed the entire election as an existential battle for the soul of the country. He stated his administration's core mission was to prevent handing the country back to neo-fascism, neo-Nazism, or authoritarianism.
When the sitting president of one of the largest, most economically vital democracies in the world explicitly names neo-Nazism not as a fringe annoyance, but as a primary existential threat to the upcoming national elections, you know this ideology has transcended fringe politics.
Definitely.
The historical legacy of the post-war fugitives, the money they laundered, the networks they built, the hate they preserved, is presenting a persistent, acute, and violent challenge to democratic stability and human rights today.
And the sources confirm it's not isolated to Brazil. In Colombia, homegrown neo-Nazism exists as a highly persistent digital phenomenon where local extremists adapt European white supremacist symbols, literally using the SS bolts, and graft them onto local anti-immigrant narratives regarding Venezuelan refugees.
We see it across the entire region.
Across the entire southern cone, local far-right groups actively use the memory and the aesthetic of those post-war fascist refugees to validate their modern authoritarian platforms. We started this deep dive looking at 1945, looking at men fleeing a ruined Europe with forged Red Cross papers, and we ended up in the headlines of today, proving the terrifying axiom that unaddressed history always comes back to collect.
We covered a massive, dense expanse of time and geography today. We traced the total collapse of the Third Reich, we exposed the mechanical logistics of the clerical rat lines, and we broke down how looted wealth, laundered through the secrecy of Swiss banks, financed an international evasion network.
We watched as these horrific fugitives seamlessly integrated into the corporate boardrooms and military dictatorships of South America, and we saw how that unbroken, carefully protected ideological lineage culminates directly in today's active extremist networks.
It is an incredibly dark journey, but an essential one for anyone trying to understand the current geopolitical climate. Because understanding the precise mechanics of how hate survives, how it funds itself, and how it reestablishes itself in new environments is the only way to effectively dismantle it.
So why does all this matter for you, listening right now?
Knowing this specific history arms you against modern misinformation and the normalization of extremism. When you understand how seamlessly the fascists of the 1940s rebranded themselves as valuable anti-communist assets for Western intelligence or as mundane corporate managers in Buenos Aires, you realize that extremism doesn't simply vanish when a peace treaty is signed.
Yeah, rebrands.
It relocates, it exploits new loopholes, and it finds new state sponsors.
We open this deep dive talking about the shattering of a comforting cinematic illusion, the idea that justice is always swift, definitive, and universal. We finally saw Argentina's secret files in May of 2025, 80 full years after the war ended. We finally got the actual receipts.
But think about the institutional denialism happening right now in places like Santa Catarina. Think about the encrypted networks modern extremists use today.
It makes you wonder, what terrifying truths, what clear evidence of state complicity and laundered funds are sitting securely in the classified archives of today's governments, just waiting for a deep dive 80 years from now.
The history of the rat lines forces us to constantly question the nature of state secrecy, the compromises made in the name of security, and who those secrets truly protect.
Something to keep you awake tonight as you look at the news. Thank you so much for joining the investigation on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative and always look for the paper trail.